In a world built on glittering fads and silent judgments, true character is not revealed in moments of comfort, but in moments of collision, when appearances deceive and humanity is laid bare. This is not just the story of Evelyn Carter, the woman whose quiet dignity shook the gilded foundations of a legendary institution. Nor is it merely the fall of Natalie Brooks, whose unchecked pride blinded her until it was too late. It is a story about all of us, about the invisible lines we draw, the assumptions we make, and the courage it takes to see beyond the surface. What happens when the one you dismiss holds the very power you thought you protected? Tonight, we invite you into a journey of failure, confrontation, mercy, and rebirth. A journey where redemption is not a gift, but a path painfully carved by choice and humility. Are you ready to walk it with us? The Belmont Grand Hotel stood like a crown jewel in the heart of the city, its towering glass facade reflecting the warm hues of the setting sun. At the same time, inside a symphony of golden chandeliers, polished marble floors, and the soft strains of a live quartet created an atmosphere of timeless grandeur. Tonight was no ordinary night. It was the Belmont Annual Gala, an event that drew the elite from every corner of the world. Business tycoons, cultural icons, diplomats, and philanthropists, all converging to celebrate a legacy of excellence that had spanned decades. The grand lobby buzzed with muted excitement, the guests gliding through the expansive hall like stars crossing the midnight sky, each movement precise, each gesture polished with the effortless confidence of old money and inherited privilege. Champagne flutes sparkled in manicured hands, discreet laughter floated beneath the soaring domes, and conversations in a dozen languages danced lightly across the marble surfaces. Staff members, impeccably dressed in tailored black uniforms, moved with silent efficiency, their eyes trained to catch the slightest need even before it was spoken. Everything about the night shimmered with an unspoken promise. This was a place where the powerful gathered not just to be seen, but to affirm their place above the ordinary. And then through the grand revolving doors, Evelyn Carter entered, and without fanfare, the air shifted in a way so subtle that most would struggle to explain it. She wore a simple emerald green dress, modest in design, but cut with such understated precision that those who knew true elegance would recognize it instantly. Around her neck, a delicate silver chain gleamed faintly beneath the chandelier's glow. Her salt and pepper hair was pinned neatly at the nape of her neck, the soft waves framing a face marked not by makeup, but by the resilient beauty of years lived with dignity and courage. In one hand, she held a finely carved wooden cane, the kind that spoke not of infirmity, but of legacy, a silent testament to a life traveled through trials and triumphs. She walked with a deliberate grace, each step measured, her back straight, her chin slightly lifted, not in arrogance, but in a quiet assertion of belonging, the kind that comes not from invitation, but from an unshakable inner certainty. The crowd parted almost instinctively, though few seemed fully aware they were doing it, as if something in Evelyn's presence commanded a deference deeper than any title or fortune could summon. Yet there were those whose glances sharpened, who whispered behind manicured hands, questioning, doubting, measuring her against an invisible standard, etched deep into the marble walls themselves. After all, she bore none of the gaudy trademarks of wealth that so many flaunted. No designer logos stamped across fabric. No heavy diamonds catching the light with calculated brilliance. She was an anomaly in this curated world, and anomalies, no matter how composed, always drew suspicion. Evelyn, however, seemed untouched by the low currents of judgment swirling around her. Her eyes, a deep, calm brown, took in the gilded opulence without awe or disdain, but with a certain bittersweet familiarity, like one greeting an old acquaintance with whom the relationship had always been uneasy. She paused for a moment, her gaze sweeping across the towering pillars and the cascading staircase that led to the grand ballroom above, where tonight's celebrations would unfold. The murmur of voices, the clinking of glass, the subtle rustle of silk and tailored wool, all of it flowed around her like a river she did not need to fight nor be swept away by. As she moved toward the velvet rope marking the entrance to the VIP lounge, her footsteps steady on the gleaming floor, a low ripple of discomfort stirred among the staff stationed nearby. They exchanged quick, almost imperceptible glances, the kind honed over years of silently enforcing unspoken rules about who belonged and who did not. Yet Evelyn Carter, with nothing but her serene poise and that intricately carved cane, walked forward unknowingly, or perhaps knowingly, toward the silent storm gathering just ahead. A storm that would not only change the course of her evening, but would leave an indelible mark on every soul who witnessed what was about to unfold. Behind the grand reception desk, where a cascade of fresh white orchids framed the polished wood and the gleaming brass nameplates, Natalie Brooks stood, observing the crowd with a practiced eye. Her tailored navy suit perfectly pressed, her blonde hair pulled into a tight, efficient bun, every inch of her projecting the image of authority and refinement that the Belmont Grand demanded from its senior staff. Natalie had long prided herself on maintaining impeccable standards, standards she believed were necessary to preserve the sanctity of the hotel's reputation. But those standards she failed to realize were often laced with threads of unconscious bias, woven so tightly into her mind that she mistook them for instinct. When her blue-gray eyes fell upon Evelyn Carter, approaching the VIP entrance, a barely perceptible tightening of her lips betrayed the judgment that immediately took root. Evelyn's understated attire, her cane, her composed but quiet demeanor, none of it aligned with the curated image Natalie associated with the Belmont elite. In Natalie's world, true VIP guests announced their presence not with quiet dignity, but with tailored Armani Cartier watches and an entourage of sycophants. She watched Evelyn walk forward with a confidence that unsettled her more than she cared to admit, a confidence that seemed misplaced in someone who, by her narrow definition, did not belong among the glittering echelon gathered tonight. Her hand resting lightly on the corner of the desk, curled into a subtle fist, a physical manifestation of the silent battle raging within her. A battle between the professionalism she was trained to display and the prejudices she refused to acknowledge existed within her. Without fully realizing it, Natalie had already made her decision, a decision that would not just alter the course of this evening, but expose a rot she had long hidden beneath layers of protocol and polished smiles. Her breath tightened in her chest as she stepped out from behind the desk, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor, each step carrying with it an invisible verdict she had already passed. In her mind, she wasn't acting out of malice. She was protecting the brand, maintaining the integrity of the VIP experience. But beneath those rationalizations, there stirred something darker, something that twisted her sense of duty into a weapon she was about to wield against a woman she knew nothing about except for the surface her biased eyes chose to see. As Natalie moved closer to Evelyn, her heart beat not with fear, but with a cold certainty that she was doing the right thing, that she was guarding the gate against an intrusion she saw as unworthy. Little did she know, with every step she took, she was not guarding the gates of prestige. She was marching headlong into a storm that would tear apart everything she believed she was protecting. Natalie approached with a fixed smile, the kind polished over years of customer service training, but beneath it simmered an arrogance so refined it disguised itself as professionalism. And as she reached Evelyn Carter, she extended one manicured hand in a gesture that was less of a greeting and more of an interception, her voice smooth yet edged with an unmistakable chill as she said, "Excuse me, ma'am. This area is reserved for guests on the official VIP registry." Her words floating over the crowd, just loud enough to be caught by nearby ears. Evelyn paused, her cane tapping lightly against the marble floor, as she turned her calm gaze onto Natalie, meeting the younger woman's eyes with a serenity that somehow made Natalie's spine stiffen further. But Natalie, fueled by a mixture of prejudice and the intoxicating rush of perceived authority, pressed on, adding, with a forced sweetness that barely masked her disdain, "I'm afraid we'll have to ask you to relocate to the general guest area, ma'am, to avoid any misunderstandings." Around them, conversations faltered, the crisp clinking of glasses slowed. A few curious glances sharpened into open stares, the kind of attention Natalie had not anticipated, but now could not withdraw from, without losing face. Evelyn said nothing at first, simply studying Natalie with a gaze so steady, so quietly powerful, that for a fleeting second Natalie almost wavered, but pride anchored her in place. In a final gesture of dismissal, Natalie gestured pointedly toward the back of the lobby, as if shooing a lost wanderer from sacred ground. Her voice clipped and brittle as she added, "This is for our very exclusive guests, you see." The words hung in the air heavier than the glittering crystal chandeliers above them, and a silence thick and uncomfortable fell over the surrounding space, as if even the walls themselves recoiled at the smallness of her remark. Evelyn slowly straightened her fingers, tightening imperceptibly around the head of her cane. Not from anger, but from the immense restraint it took to meet such naked disrespect with grace. And when she finally spoke, her voice was low even, and carried not a hint of rage but a weight that made the nearest onlookers involuntarily hold their breath. "I see," Evelyn said softly, her eyes never leaving Natalie's face, and with that simple, devastating response, she reached into the small clutch at her side and retrieved a thick ivory invitation card embossed with gold lettering, an unmistakable symbol of the highest honor the Belmont Grand could bestow. She extended it toward Natalie, offering it not with defiance, but with a composed dignity that made the entire scene and Natalie's conduct look all the more shameful. For a fraction of a second, Natalie's facade cracked uncertainty flickering across her features, but she had already set the stage and the audience was watching, so rather than retreat with humility, she doubled down, snatching the card brusquely from Evelyn's hand, her motions sharp and graceless, her judgment already sealing her fate in ways she could not yet fathom. The ivory card trembled slightly in Natalie's hand, not from the weight of the invitation, but from the sudden creeping realization that something was wrong, but still clinging stubbornly to her assumptions. She barely spared it a glance before tucking it dismissively into the folder on the podium beside her, an act so casual and contemptuous that a low murmur began to ripple through the gathered guests, who had turned their attention to the unfolding scene. Yet Evelyn Carter did not flinch, did not raise her voice, did not allow even a flicker of anger to mar the composure that years of weathering storms had forged within her. Instead, she remained precisely where she stood, her posture straight, her chin lifted just slightly, her gaze cool and unyielding as she fixed it upon Natalie with a gravity that seemed to thicken the very air between them. Her fingers still resting on the handle of her cane, tapped once against the marble floor, with a sound so sharp it sliced through the awkward silence like a blade commanding attention without a single word. For those who truly observed it, was clear Evelyn was not a woman who needed to shout to be heard. Her authority was the kind that emanated from within, rooted in a life spent carving a path through obstacles far more vicious than a haughty gatekeeper at a hotel gala. The crowd, sensing the shift in atmosphere, grew even quieter, the polished laughter and clinking glasses of moments ago, now feeling grotesquely out of place against the rawness of the moment. Somewhere at the edges of the room, a violinist faltered briefly before recovering the single broken note hanging heavy in the charged air. Evelyn's eyes never wavered from Natalie's increasingly flushed face, and in a voice so calm, so measured, it made Natalie's heart skip an anxious beat. Evelyn finally spoke her words, cutting through the tension like a scalpel. "You have just made a very serious mistake, young lady." There was no malice in her tone, no drama, only a profound certainty, the kind that comes from knowing the truth will reveal itself inevitably without the need for force or spectacle. And with that, Evelyn Carter turned away, not with haste or anger, but with a deliberate grace that was infinitely more devastating than any outburst could have been, leaving Natalie standing frozen behind the podium, clutching a folder that now felt heavier than stone as the whispering crowd closed in around her, bearing witness to a humiliation that had only just begun. As Evelyn moved with unshaken dignity toward the velvet ropes marking the entrance to the grand ballroom, a sharp voice cut through the thickening murmur of the crowd, halting her mid-step. "Stop right there!" Natalie barked, the brittle edge of panic now evident beneath her falsely composed tone. And before anyone could fully comprehend what was happening, Natalie rushed forward, her heels clicking with frantic urgency against the marble, reaching out and, in a moment so breathtakingly disrespectful that it seemed to suspend time itself, she snatched at Evelyn's arm, grasping for the invitation folder she had earlier discarded so carelessly. Evelyn, caught off guard by the sudden physicality, tightened her grip instinctively on her cane, her body stiffening not from fear, but from the sheer shock of being manhandled so publicly, an experience she had endured far too many times in another uglier era she had hoped society had long left behind. Gasps erupted from the onlookers, their once passive interest morphing into outright horror as they witnessed a spectacle that should never have happened inside these hallowed, glittering halls. And yet, here it was, an elderly woman of evident grace and poise being physically accosted by a representative of the very institution meant to serve her. Natalie, realizing too late the magnitude of her error, but unable to retreat without losing face entirely, clung stubbornly to her course, her voice rising sharply as she accused, "You need to leave immediately. You're causing a disturbance." her words shrill, desperate, bouncing harshly off the grand marble pillars and echoing through the stunned lobby. Evelyn said nothing. She merely pulled her arm free with a quiet strength that seemed to reverberate louder than any shouted protest could have her phase a mask of stoic composure that made Natalie's hysteria seem all the more grotesque by comparison. The ornate gold-trimmed folder fell to the floor with a muted slap scattering its contents. Among them, the official VIP gala invitation, bearing Evelyn's name, embossed in gold leaf and unmistakably authentic for all to see. Several guests gasped audibly, and a young man near the bar hastily pulled out his phone, beginning to record, sensing that this moment would not only define the evening, but perhaps shake the very foundations of the Belmont Grand's gilded reputation. Natalie, still standing there, her chest heaving, her cheeks burning with a toxic mixture of rage and fear, realized somewhere deep in her rattled consciousness that the ground beneath her was beginning to crumble, but pride, fierce, blinding pride, kept her rooted in place, blind to the storm she had just unleashed. As the velvet folder lay splayed across the marble floor, its golden letters gleaming defiantly under the harsh brilliance of the chandeliers, a deep, commanding voice sliced through the charged atmosphere, making every head in the lobby turn with a start. What exactly is going on here? The voice belonged to a tall, silver-haired man striding forward from the far end of the hall, his black suit tailored to perfection, his polished shoes cutting silent paths across the floor. And in his presence alone, there was an authority so palpable that the crowd instinctively parted for him like water before a prow. Daniel Whitmore, the chief executive officer of the Belmont Grand Hotel, a man revered for his sharp mind and iron sense of justice, approached the scene with narrowed eyes, taking in the scattered papers, the visible tension hanging between Evelyn and Natalie, and the stunned expressions of the guests, who now stood as silent witnesses to an unfolding disaster. Natalie, upon recognizing him visibly, paled, her mouth opening slightly as if to speak, but no words came. Her hands, which had been so quick and forceful only moments ago, now hung awkwardly at her sides as the gravity of her actions finally began to sink in. Daniel did not immediately address her. Instead, his attention turned to Evelyn, and in that instant, his entire demeanor shifted, not with the empty politeness reserved for patrons, but with a depth of genuine respect that few ever witnessed from the notoriously reserved executive. Without hesitation, Daniel inclined his head in a gesture so formal, so deliberate, that it stunned the onlookers into a new, heavier silence. It was not merely an apology, it was an acknowledgement, a tribute paid from a man who knew exactly who stood before him. "Ms. Carter," he said, his voice low, reverent, "please accept my sincerest apologies for this appalling incident." Gasps rippled through the crowd as realization flickered across the faces of those who had, up until this moment, doubted Evelyn's right to be there. Natalie stood frozen, her world tilting violently as the truth slammed into her like a physical blow. And she understood, with a sickening clarity, that she had not just humiliated a guest, she had humiliated Evelyn Carter, the founder and matriarch of the entire Belmont Grand legacy. The very woman whose vision, perseverance, and unyielding standards had built the institution Natalie so blindly believed she was protecting. Around them, phones began discreetly recording not from cruelty, but from the collective understanding that they were witnessing a seismic shift, a reckoning brought about not by rage or retribution, but by the quiet, unassailable dignity of a woman who had refused to bow. Daniel's eyes, normally so measured and cool now, burned with a cold fury as he slowly turned to Natalie, his voice dropping to a near whisper, more terrifying than any shouted reprimand. "You have no idea the depth of the mistake you have made tonight." And with those words, the elegant facade of the evening shattered completely, leaving behind only the raw, inescapable truth. The silence that followed Daniel Whitmore's grave pronouncement was so absolute that even the faint hum of the air conditioning seemed deafening. The crowd standing as if carved from stone, their collective breath held tight within their chests as they awaited the words they somehow already sensed would alter everything. Daniel took a slow breath, his jaw tightening, and when he spoke again, each word fell with the weight of a gavel striking down on an irreversible verdict. "Allow me to introduce to you not merely our most honored guest of the evening, but the very woman who founded the Belmont Grand legacy. You now stand within Miss Evelyn Carter. Chairwoman and visionary, is the heart and soul behind everything this institution claims to represent. A collective gasp rippled outward like a shockwave, shattering whatever lingering illusions remained, and a visible tremor ran through Natalie's body as the full enormity of her mistake crushed down upon her with merciless force, her knees buckling slightly as she grasped the edge of the reception podium for support, her face drained of all color, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly like a marionette cut from its strings. All around them, the gathered guests began to murmur, not with gossip, but with a growing sense of outrage, shame, and disbelief that such a profound injustice had been committed under their passive watch. And a few instinctively lowered their phones, the reality before them, too raw, too painful to continue documenting. Evelyn stood in the center of it all, her emerald dress catching the light like a quiet flame, her cane steady by her side, her expression unchanging. No triumph, no bitterness, only a profound, quiet sadness that seemed to age the opulence of the lobby itself. She did not revel in the revelation. She did not need to. Her very presence, her unwavering grace under fire, was an indictment far more devastating than any public condemnation Daniel or anyone else could have delivered. Natalie, feeling the walls of her reality collapsing inward with crushing inevitability, tried to form words, tried to summon apologies or explanations, but nothing coherent would come, only a pitiful broken sound that barely escaped her lips. Daniel turned his cold gaze back to her, his voice now sharp enough to slice through bone as he declared, "You have insulted not only a guest, but the very foundation upon which your employment here was built. Your actions have disgraced this institution and everything it stands for." Natalie could only nod weakly, tears welling in her eyes, but she knew even as they fell that no apology would suffice, that there were mistakes so colossal they could not be mended with words, and around her the judgment of the crowd silent, but searing closed in like an iron ring, sealing her fate long before any official decree would be spoken. The silence that had engulfed the grand lobby cracked subtly as two security personnel, impeccably dressed in discreet black suits bearing the hotel's insignia, emerged from the periphery, moving with a grim purpose toward Natalie, whose hands, once so eager to gesture authority, now trembled uncontrollably at her sides. She flinched at their approach, instinctively shrinking away, as if hoping to melt into the ornate marble beneath her feet. But there was no escape. No corner dark enough to hide the magnitude of her humiliation. Daniel Whitmore gave a brief, almost imperceptible nod, and the two security officers stopped just a respectful distance from Natalie, their presence alone, an unspoken command leaving no room for negotiation, no avenue for pride to mount a last-minute defense. Around them, the gathered guests watched in frozen silence the gilded splendor of the evening, now a cruel contrast to the public dismantling of a woman who minutes earlier had wielded her badge of authority like a sword, and now stood stripped of it, exposed raw and irreparably broken, before an audience that would remember her disgrace far longer than they would recall the names of any honored guest announced that night. One of the officers, a man with kind but resolute eyes, stepped slightly closer and said in a low, firm voice, "Miss Brooks, please come with us." And though his tone carried no cruelty, the simple inevitability of the words struck harder than any shout ever could. Natalie's legs refused to cooperate at first, locking stiffly as her mind raced for some fragment of dignity to cling to. But there was nothing left. She was an empty vessel, now drained by the full, merciless glare of the truth. Slowly, mechanically, she moved away from the reception desk, her once confident stride reduced to a hollow shuffle, the sound of her heels tapping unevenly across the marble, seeming unbearably loud in the oppressive stillness. As she passed Evelyn, who remained standing motionless like an unshakable monument amidst the ruins of Natalie's crumbling facade, she dared a glance upward, hoping for anger, for condemnation, for something she could use to fuel her own battered pride, but found instead a look of quiet, devastating disappointment. A gaze so heavy with sorrow that it pierced deeper than any fury ever could. That single glance from Evelyn was the final blow, the last severing thread that cut Natalie adrift from whatever illusions she had clung to about who she was and what she represented. She bowed her head, a gesture that was not strategic, not performed, but involuntary, the purest physical manifestation of a soul recognizing its own failure. And as the security officers gently guided her toward the back corridors leading to the staff offices, the crowd for the first time that evening allowed themselves to breathe, their collective exhale filled not with relief, but with the heavy, inescapable knowledge that they had witnessed something far more profound than a simple firing. They had witnessed the collision of arrogance against dignity and the quiet, unstoppable triumph of truth over appearances. The sterile hum of the overhead fluorescent lights buzzed faintly as Natalie Brooks sat alone at the end of a long, gleaming mahogany conference table, deep within the administrative wing of the Belmont Grand. The grandeur of the public spaces outside, replaced here by cold efficiency and the suffocating intimacy of scrutiny. Across from her, seated in severe leather chairs, were the members of the hotel's executive disciplinary board, their faces impassive. Their hands folded neatly atop thick dossiers bearing her name in bold accusatory typeface. Daniel Whitmore sat at the head of the table, his expression carved from granite, the open file before him, containing not only the damning footage already spreading like wildfire across social media, but also written statements from guests, staff, and security personnel who had all witnessed the collapse of professionalism that had marred the most prestigious evening of the year. Natalie shifted uncomfortably in her chair. The once crisp lines of her uniform now wilted and rumpled her eyes hollow from the weight of her own disgrace. But no amount of straightening her posture or smoothing her skirt could erase the vivid image of her downfall still playing behind the eyes of everyone in the room. Daniel steepled his fingers together and spoke first, his voice low and devoid of sympathy. "Miss Brooks, you stand before this board, today accused of conduct unbecoming of your position, including but not limited to public discrimination against a guest, unauthorized physical contact, and actions that have severely damaged the reputation of the Belmont Grand Hotel." The words fell like stones into the cavernous silence, each one sinking deeper into Natalie's already crumbling defenses. Another board member, a stern woman with sharp spectacles perched on her nose, slid a printed transcript across the table toward her, the bold black text documenting each damning moment of her interaction with Evelyn Carter, from the initial words laced with disdain to the physical attempt to remove her, culminating in the ultimate humiliation of having Evelyn's credentials tossed aside and disrespected. Natalie's trembling hands barely managed to unfold the document, her vision blurring as she scanned the official account of her own arrogance, each line a mirror reflecting a version of herself she could no longer deny. There was no point in protest. The evidence was irrefutable, the witnesses plentiful, and her own conscience at last awakened by brutal necessity left her defenseless. She opened her mouth once, twice, but the words she had rehearsed, the excuses, the justifications died on her tongue, shriveling into nothingness beneath the cold, expectant gaze of those who had once seen her as a rising star in their ranks. Finally, Natalie lowered the paper, her hands falling limply onto her lap, and met Daniel's eyes with a shattered gaze that no longer sought forgiveness, but merely acknowledgement of her guilt. The weight of her own actions pressed down on her, heavier than any sentence the board could hand down. And in that sterile, echoing room, Natalie Brooks understood that what had been broken could never fully be repaired. The heavy door of the conference room creaked open with a soft but deliberate sound that sliced cleanly through the sterile atmosphere, and as all heads turned in unison, Evelyn Carter entered her presence alone, commanding the kind of solemn respect that no title or ceremony could fabricate. Her emerald dress replaced now by a sleek charcoal gray suit that seemed to absorb the harsh fluorescent light rather than reflect it, her cane tapping once against the polished floor as she advanced toward the center of the room with the calm inevitability of a verdict long foreseen. Daniel Whitmore immediately rose to his feet, setting the example for the rest of the board, and one by one, the executive stood in silent acknowledgement of the woman who had built the Belmont Grand, not from privilege or fortune, but from a lifetime of perseverance, vision, and an unyielding refusal to be diminished. Natalie, seated alone at the far end of the table, felt her entire being shrink inward, her throat tightening painfully as she struggled against the wave of shame that threatened to drown her entirely. Yet, she could not look away. She owed Evelyn that much, the bare minimum of facing the person she had wronged so gravely. Evelyn stopped a few paces away from the head of the table, her gaze sweeping briefly across the assembled leadership, before settling on Natalie, not with cruelty, not even with anger, but with a heavy, aching sadness that seemed to weigh more than all the marble and gold in the hotel combined. For a long moment, the room remained suspended in breathless silence, every individual within it acutely aware that whatever Evelyn chose to say would carry consequences far beyond the walls of that sterile room. When she finally spoke, her voice was low even, but carried an unshakable authority that made the air itself seem to tighten around every word. I have been given the authority to determine the appropriate course of action regarding Miss Brooks. She began, and though her tone was devoid of malice, each syllable fell like a quiet thunderclap. It would be easy, she continued, her eyes never wavering from Natalie's stricken face, to simply demand her immediate termination, to strip her of her title and her dignity, to cast her out as an example for others to fear. It would be swift, it would be satisfying to some, but it would change nothing. A ripple of confusion flickered across the faces of the board members, unused to mercy, appearing where punishment was expected, but Evelyn pressed on, her voice gathering strength. Real change does not come from erasing mistakes. It comes from confronting them, from forcing those who have failed to see their failure, not as an end, but as the beginning of something better. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink into the room's very bones, then turned back to Daniel, her decision clear and irrevocable. I recommend that Miss Brooks not be terminated. Instead, she shall undergo 6 months of intensive re-education in cultural sensitivity, unconscious bias, and service ethics under direct supervision, reporting not to her immediate manager, but to the Ethics and Integrity Council, and I will personally oversee her progress. The board murmured quietly among themselves, some in shock, others in reluctant admiration, but no one dared oppose her. Natalie, who had prepared herself for the final blow of dismissal, felt the breath she had been holding shudder out of her in a soundless gasp, not from relief, but from the overwhelming realization that mercy could be a far heavier burden than punishment. For Evelyn was not offering her a way out. She was offering her a mirror, one Natalie would be forced to face every single day until the reflection staring back was no longer one shaped by arrogance and prejudice, but by true understanding and humility. Evelyn gave one final glance around the room, her gaze sharp and unflinching, before she turned and walked out with the same quiet dignity she had carried in leaving behind. A silence filled not with victory, but with the weighty, painful promise of redemption. The first morning of Natalie Brooks's re-education began not with the polished routine she had once mastered at the Belmont Grand, but with the jarring ring of a plain alarm clock in a modest training center, miles away from the opulence she once believed was her birthright. And as she dragged herself out of the thin, uncomfortable bed, dressed in a simple uniform, devoid of rank or adornment, and made her way to the small, stark classroom, she felt each step strip away another layer of the persona she had so carefully constructed over the years. Inside the room, the walls were bare, the lighting flat, the rows of chairs identical, and at the front stood a tall, calm instructor, a man who introduced himself only as Mr. Langston, whose quiet authority filled the room more powerfully than any shouted lecture could have. His first words were simple, yet carried the crushing weight of the task ahead. You are not here to defend yourselves, you are here to confront yourselves. Natalie sat among a small group of others employees from different industries who, like her, had crossed invisible lines they once thought themselves immune to, and as the morning sessions unfolded, she was forced to listen, to truly listen, to stories of humiliation, injustice, and silent suffering recounted by those who had lived through discrimination, not as a singular mistake, but as a daily grinding reality. No excuses were allowed, no interruptions permitted. The rules were brutal in their simplicity. Absorb, reflect, admit. And each day Natalie faced exercises designed to peel away her ingrained defenses. The casual justifications, the practiced smiles, the assumptions she had absorbed without question. She sat through simulated boarding scenarios where actors, some wealthy, some poor, some in designer suits, others in worn jackets, challenged her to confront how instinctively she made judgments based on appearance alone. She was made to review footage of her own actions at the Belmont Grand, watching herself frame by agonizing frame, as she dismissed, demeaned, and ultimately assaulted a woman whose dignity had dwarfed her own at every turn. There was no hiding from it now. Every flinch, every curl of the lip, every impatient gesture played back before her eyes like an unrelenting indictment. In the afternoons, she attended lectures on the systemic roots of bias, learning about histories she had once considered irrelevant to her carefully curated world, histories that revealed how prejudice did not need to be loud or violent to be devastating. It only needed to be silent, unchecked, and believed to be normal. And at night, when the sessions ended and the trainees returned to their plain rooms, Natalie sat on the narrow bed, staring into the blank ceiling, feeling the crushing weight of her ignorance settle deeper into her bones, knowing that awareness alone was not enough to redeem her. True change would not be measured by passing tests or receiving certificates. It would be measured by the small private decisions she made when no one was watching, by whether she could silence the voice inside her that still sought to justify, to defend, to separate herself from the harm she had caused. As the days blurred into weeks, the rigid pride that had once defined her posture began to dissolve, replaced by a humility so raw it often left her trembling, a humility born not from public shame, but from the slow, painful birth of true self-awareness. And through it all, Evelyn Carter's words echoed in her mind, relentless and inescapable. Change does not come from erasing mistakes. It comes from confronting them. Natalie had stepped into this journey thinking she might earn forgiveness. Now she understood that forgiveness was not something she could claim. It was something she had to live worthy of every day for the rest of her life. 6 months later, under a sky washed in the pale gold of a rising sun, Natalie Brooks stood once again before the towering glass facade of the Belmont Grand Hotel. But the woman reflected back at her from the pristine windows was no longer the polished, unthinking enforcer of privilege she had once been. Dressed simply in a navy dress with no adornments, her hair loose around her shoulders, her hands trembling slightly not from fear of judgment, but from the heavy responsibility of carrying the lessons she had been forced to learn. She took a slow breath, steadying herself before stepping into the grand lobby that now felt larger, heavier, almost sacred in its memory. The marble gleamed as it always had, the chandeliers spilled golden light across the floors, but Natalie noticed things now she never had before. The nervous fidget of a young doorman smoothing his jacket, the wary glance of a guest clutching a worn leather bag too tightly, the way status and assumptions floated invisible and dangerous in every interaction. She moved carefully through the space, not to command it, but to belong to it humbly. And when she approached the velvet ropes marking the VIP lounge, she did not expect passage. She waited respectfully until an attendant one she did not recognize smiled and gestured her through without hesitation. Not because of how she looked, but because of the invitation carefully folded in her hand. At the far end of the lounge, near the floor-to-ceiling windows where the morning light poured in like a river of fire, stood Evelyn Carter, her back straight, her cane resting lightly by her side, her presence unchanged, calm, immovable, yet infinitely human. Natalie's steps slowed as she crossed the carpeted floor, each footfall a reminder of the countless invisible barriers she had once upheld without question. And when she finally reached Evelyn, she paused, lowering her gaze in a gesture not rehearsed, but instinctive, born from the profound understanding that no apology could ever fully erase the damage she had caused, but that perhaps in humility there could be a beginning. "Ms. Carter," she said, her voice low, steady, despite the lump rising in her throat. "I have completed the training you assigned. I know it doesn't undo what happened, and I don't expect forgiveness. I just want you to know, I am not the same person who stood here 6 months ago." For a long moment, Evelyn said nothing, her deep brown eyes studying Natalie with a stillness that felt heavier than any spoken judgment. And Natalie stood silently under that gaze, accepting whatever conclusion might come. Finally, Evelyn gave the smallest of nods, a gesture so subtle that most would have missed it. But to Natalie, it felt like the unlocking of a heavy door, long closed. Evelyn's voice, when it came, was soft, yet powerful. "Redemption is not owed. It is earned choice by choice, day by day. Your journey is not finished. Natalie, it has only just begun." Natalie swallowed hard tears stinging the back of her eyes, but she did not let them fall. She only nodded, understanding that the road ahead would be long, often invisible to others, but absolutely essential to who she would choose to become. Evelyn turned her gaze back toward the vast window, where the city unfurled like a living, breathing testament to resilience. And for the first time in a very long while, Natalie allowed herself a small, tentative smile. Not of triumph, not of absolution, but of hope, fragile and fierce. And beneath the soaring ceilings of the Belmont Grand, with history whispering in every gilded corner, a new story quietly began. Not of titles or appearances, but of humility, perseverance, and the quiet, unstoppable power of change. This story did not end with Natalie Brooks' fall, nor even with her trembling apology beneath the vaulted ceilings of the Belmont Grand. It truly began in the quiet steps that followed, steps heavier than any punishment, lighter than any praise, but real, relentless, and transformative. In a world quick to cancel, but slow to heal, Evelyn Carter chose the harder path to plant a seed of change where bitterness could have grown. And Natalie, once the enforcer of unseen barriers, now walks forward day by day, dismantling those very walls within herself. Perhaps the most powerful revolutions are not those that roar, but those that begin in silence within the soul. What about you? If you were Evelyn, would you have had the strength to offer mercy when it was least deserved? Would you have had the courage to rebuild what arrogance tried to destroy? We invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you, please share it with those who need to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that challenge, inspire, and heal. Thank you for being part of this journey.